Imagine the clock has just ticked close to midnight as all of Washington, D.C. lies fast asleep. A political earthquake has quietly detonated inside the headquarters of the Republican National Committee, one with destructive force far greater than any angry tweet or noisy protest you have ever witnessed. There were no sirens, no flashing press cameras. There was only an envelope rushed by courier containing the signatures of 23 of the most powerful figures in the Republican camp, including 3 sitting committee chairmen. Its contents: a death sentence for Donald Trump's political career. And the most terrifying part is this: it was not an attack from the Democrats, nor the kind of anonymous rumor so common in modern politics. This was a cold-blooded coup launched from within by the very people who once swore absolute loyalty to him. When a king's closest generals gather in the dark of night to overthrow their own ruler, you know that an irreversible catastrophe has already occurred. So what unspeakable event forced them to turn their backs at that very moment? In truth, this rebellion did not arise out of thin air. For months, the atmosphere inside the Republican Party had grown thick, like a pressure cooker on the verge of explosion. Tensions had long been simmering, fueled by Trump's relentless attacks on any member who dared question his election claims, or by his refusal to support traditional GOP candidates. Explosive clashes with Senate leadership over legislative priorities carved deep and widening cracks within the party. Yet until this fateful night, everything remained confined to whispers behind closed doors and weary headshakes inside private meetings. Tonight, everything changed. The letter sent at 11:47 p.m. marked the point of no return, when 3 powerful committee chairmen publicly put pen to paper demanding an emergency vote to strip Trump of his leadership role within the party. They knowingly wagered their entire political lives. This was no longer a dispute over ideology or campaign strategy. It was a blunt declaration that the old power structure had collapsed. But what ignited this final fuse? Why now? The answer has nothing to do with disagreements over tax policy or border security. The collapse of this political alliance traces back to a specific event, a dark secret exposed on January 12th, the day the line between politics and criminality was believed to have been completely erased. And what they now hold in their hands is not merely a letter, but evidence of an unforgivable betrayal. If the midnight letter was the opening gunshot, then what was revealed on January 12th was the nuclear arsenal that triggered this entire war. The collapse of a political alliance that had endured for nearly a decade did not stem from vague ideological disagreements. It came from a Pandora's box flung open in the very heart of Washington, unleashing secrets so dark that even the most battle-hardened politicians recoiled in horror. At the center of the storm was a digital audio recording, not secondhand gossip, notes from some anonymous third-party source, but a voice clear, unmistakable, and commanding the voice of former President Donald Trump. The recording originated from an ultra-private fundraising event in Palm Beach on the evening of January 8th. Picture the scene. Expensive suits, glittering chandeliers, top-shelf champagne, and a sense of absolute safety inside the gold-plated walls of a private club. There, amid the smiles and applause of powerful donors, Donald Trump felt at ease. And when he felt at ease, the political mask slipped, revealing his rawest calculations. He did not know that every word, every breath, every ruthless plan was being recorded, only to become 4 days later the most damning indictment against himself. When the tape was played during the emergency meeting on January 12th, the silence that blanketed the room was not one of respect, but of terror. What the 23 senior Republican figures heard was not a careless remark or the familiar bravado of political trash talk. No, this was something altogether different. Legal and political experts who later assessed the recording concluded that it constituted evidence of weaponizing the government on a scale without precedent in American history. On the tape, Trump was not discussing foreign policy, the economy, or the border. He was calmly, methodically, and in chilling detail outlining how to turn the federal executive branch into a personal mercenary force for internal purges. The first shock that sent a chill down listeners' spines was the specificity of the threats. He did not speak in generalities about traitors or the opposition. He named names, a literal kill list. The voice on the recording called out sitting Republican lawmakers one by one, cited their electoral districts, and even detailed the actions he deemed wrongdoing to justify investigations. These were not Democratic enemies, but former allies whose only crime was refusing to offer unconditional support for his election challenges or daring to exercise independent judgment as legislators. But the true horror lay in the methods. The recording revealed a brutal plan to wield the Department of Justice as a sword hanging over the head of anyone who stepped out of line. He discussed installing loyalists in key positions, people willing to sign indictments based on loyalty rather than legal evidence. "We need our people in there to handle them," the voice said, openly suggesting the transformation of the nation's highest law enforcement body into an instrument of revenge. It did not stop there. The cruelty extended into the financial realm, the lifeblood of any political career. The recording captured explicit instructions to use the Internal Revenue Service to launch surprise audits against stubborn lawmakers. Imagine the crushing pressure of having your personal, family, and business finances torn apart by the federal tax authority simply because you refuse to vote according to one man's wishes. Alongside this was a plan to mobilize super PAC's vast money-burning machines to bankroll primary challengers, draining the financial resources of intra-party rivals. This was not mere intimidation. It was a comprehensive annihilation campaign, destroying reputations through the law and suffocating livelihoods through money. Yet the most seismic detail, the one that left even seasoned committee chairmen, long accustomed to political hardball, utterly stunned, was the timing. In a segment sources described as calculated cruelty, Trump discussed synchronizing these investigations with the 2026 midterm election calendar. This was not a burst of anger. It was a conspiracy. He spoke of keeping investigations simmering and unleashing subpoenas or search warrants at the most sensitive moments of campaign season. Artificially engineered October surprises designed to inflict maximum political damage. The goal was not justice. The goal was to ensure that dissenters would lose their seats, their reputations, and be permanently expelled from political life precisely when they needed voter support the most. At that moment, the line between a political leader and a mafia boss vanished entirely in the minds of those present. They realized that state power designed to protect citizens was being discussed as a private toy to enforce loyalty. This weaponization crossed every moral and legal red line. It turned Republican lawmakers into hostages within their own party. On one side stood pressure from the base, which still idolized Trump. On the other, the barrels of the DOJ and IRS aimed squarely at the backs of their heads should they misstep. The sheer specificity, detail, and cold calculation captured in the January 8th recording obliterated all remaining hesitation. It transformed doubt into immediate, visceral fear. Those seated in the RNC meeting that night grasped a brutal truth. They were no longer fighting for an ideology or a party. They were fighting for their own survival against a machine designed to crush anyone who dared speak the truth. Pandora's box had been opened, and the demon inside was no stranger. It was the very man they once called Mr. President, and now that the secret was exposed, there was no way back for anyone. When the final sound of the recording faded away, leaving only the faint digital hiss of the speaker echoing in the air, the secure conference room in the basement of an office building near Capitol Hill fell into a state that could only be described with two words: utter paralysis. This was not the silence of contemplation, nor the stillness of respect. It was the silence of a funeral for a belief that had endured nearly a decade, and perhaps a funeral for the very careers of those seated in the room if they failed to act immediately. For the next 4 hours, the air inside the room thickened, so suffocating it felt as if it could be cut with a knife. 23 people, the most seasoned politicians in America, individuals who had weathered terrorism, economic collapse, and explosive sex scandals, now sat motionless like wax figures. They stared at the polished mahogany tabletop, avoiding one another's eyes. In their minds, ordinary political calculations had vanished, replaced by a primal fear, the fear of prey, realizing that the hunter was the very master they had served for years. They were used to Donald Trump attacking Democrats. They were used to it and had even applauded when he went after the media. But hearing that familiar voice calmly, plotting the destruction of them, their own allies, men and women who wore the same colors and fought on the same side, was a psychological shock of an entirely different magnitude. It was like discovering that your commanding general had been secretly planting mines beneath his soldiers' beds while they slept. In the heavy atmosphere of suspicion and disorientation, all eyes gradually turned toward the far end of the table where Senator Marcus Webb of South Carolina sat. If anyone in that room embodied absolute loyalty to Donald Trump, it was Marcus Webb. He was not merely an ally. He was a bodyguard, an impenetrable human shield. Since 2015, when many in the party still dismissed Trump as a joke, Webb was the first to step onto the stage, grasp the New York billionaire's hand, and publicly declare his support. Webb had traveled with Trump through more than 40 states, shared hundreds of podiums, absorbed relentless attacks from the media, and even sacrificed his own personal reputation to defend Trump through 2 impeachments and countless indictments. To Webb, loyalty was a creed, a matter of honor for a Southern man. But now the man known as the Firewall looked as though he had aged a decade in just a few hours. His face was ashen, his eyes hollow, staring into an empty void. His red tie, the familiar symbol of power, hung, loosened, and crooked at his collar. Then, in the bone-chilling silence, a chair scraped sharply against the floor. Marcus Webb slowly stood up. The entire room held its breath. They were waiting for a defense. They were waiting for Webb to do what he had always done for the past 8 years, find some angle to justify it all, claim the tape was fake, selectively edited, or merely the president's figurative language. They expected him to deploy the familiar maneuver to calm everyone down and call for unity, but he did not. Webb braced both hands on the table, his knuckles turning white from the force as if it were the only thing keeping him from collapsing. He bowed his head, his shoulders trembling slightly. When he looked up, his colleagues were stunned to see tears welling in those once unyielding eyes. These were not tears of weakness, but tears of shattering the collapse of an ironclad belief betrayed in the cruelest possible way. Ladies and gentlemen, Webb's voice rang out, hoarse sorrow and shaking, breaking the deadly silence. You all know who I am. You know what I've done. Aid is, he paused, swallowing hard, struggling to contain the surge of emotion rising in his chest. I stood in front of thousands of cameras, in front of millions of voters to defend this man. When the entire world turned its back on him after January 6th, I stood there when federal indictments came crashing down like a flood. I stood there, I endured humiliation. I lost lifelong friends. I was even alienated by members of my own family, all because I believed he was the best choice for this country. I believed that beneath all that chaos, he valued those who fought for him. Webb lifted a hand to his forehead, a gesture of utter despair. His voice hardened, filled with pain. But today, what I heard was not politics. It was not strategy. He pointed at the lone speaker, sitting in the middle of the table, his finger trembling with fury. On that tape, he wasn't talking about defeating Democrats. He was talking about destroying us. He talked about using the IRS to audit your wives' and children's bank accounts. He talked about using the FBI to knock on your doors in the middle of the night. He's sharpening the knife not for our enemies, but for the people sitting in this very room. The room seemed to be drained of all air. Webb's words struck like sledgehammers against every mind present. I defended this man through every storm, Webb continued, his voice breaking as tears streamed down his weathered cheeks. I accepted being the villain in the eyes of half the country to protect him. But he choked, taking several seconds to steady his breath. But I cannot defend someone who is pointing a gun at his own teammates. I cannot defend someone who treats our loyalty as a weakness to be exploited, not a virtue to be honored. It's Dalt saying God Webb scanned the room, his gaze meeting each person in turn. From Senator Thornton, Representative Mercer, friends and comrades who had shared the political trenches with him for years. If we walk out of this room and stay silent, we are not just cowards. We are accomplices to our own suicide. We are handing him the bullet to fire straight into our hearts. My conscience, my honor, no longer allow me to do that." End quote. He released his grip on the table, stood upright, wiped his tears with the back of his hand, and delivered the verdict on his own past. "For me, it's over." The words fell into the room like a 1,000-ton stone. Webb sat back down, burying his face in his hands. The suppressed sobbing of that powerful man echoed softly, but in that silence it sounded like thunder. That moment was the breaking point. Marcus Webb's collapse triggered a psychological domino effect across all 23 people in the room. If Webb, the most loyal bodyguard, the man willing to take a bullet for Trump, had finally let go, what reason did any of them have to keep clinging to illusion? The awakening was immediate and brutal. The fog of personal worship evaporated, revealing the naked truth of survival instinct. They realized that their relationship with Trump was not symbiotic. It was parasitic, and they were the hosts being drained dry. Senator James Thornton, the famously composed chairman of the Ethics Committee, was the first to speak after Webb. He did not cry. His face was icy, but his voice carried lethal resolve. "Marcus is right," Thornton said, staring directly at the others. "That tape proves he doesn't see us as allies. He sees us as expendable pawns, and when a pawn stops obeying, he eliminates it not with ballots, but with handcuffs and subpoenas." And at 7A, Representative Diana Mercer, the Iron Woman of the Judiciary Committee, followed her voice razor sharp. "This is no longer a partisan moral issue. This is about political survival and personal freedom. Did you hear the part about 2026? He wants us out of office, bankrupt, and in prison. If we don't strike first, we'll be the next names on that blacklist. This is a war for survival. Either he goes or we do." The atmosphere in the room shifted abruptly from confusion and fear. It transformed into desperate resistance. Phones were pulled out, notebooks reopened. No one was talking anymore about how to contain this. The only question that existed now was, how do we survive? They realized they were facing a real-life version of the prisoner's dilemma. If they stayed silent and someone else released the tape, they would be branded accomplices in a cover-up. If they stayed silent and Trump returned to power, they would live in permanent fear of purges. The only path to protecting themselves, their families, and their careers was collective action. They had to become whistleblowers, defenders of democracy, before Trump could turn them into criminals or corpses. Blind loyalty died the moment Marcus Webb broke down in tears. In its place rose the instinct for self-preservation. "We need to draft the document now," a voice said from the corner of the room. "And it has to be sent before midnight. We need to strike before he can react." That was when the clock began counting down toward 11:47 p.m. The closed-door meeting shifted from shock into a full-fledged war room. The strongest, sharpest language was chosen for the letter. There was no more restraint. They knew that once the letter left the room, there would be no turning back. They would become the #1 enemies of the most powerful man in the party and of millions of loyal voters outside. But when they looked at Marcus Webb, still sitting there hollow-eyed and broken, they knew that the cost of turning back would be 1,000 times greater. That night in Washington, loyalty did not merely collapse. It was incinerated by the fire of truth, leaving behind only the ashes of a life or death resolve among people driven into a corner. The coup had officially begun, not out of ambition for power, but out of sheer terror of their own leader. When dawn broke over Washington on January 13th, its light did not bring hope. Instead, it exposed the deep fractures tearing through the very foundation of the Republican Party. The fateful letter had been sent, and its impact went far beyond political chaos. It had triggered a devastating chain reaction, an unstoppable domino effect, toppling the three most critical pillars propping up Donald Trump's power, legal legitimacy, financial lifeblood, and the voters' ballot. First came the legal tsunami. In the past, whenever Trump found himself in trouble, a cadre of conservative scholars and constitutional law experts would rush to his defense, branding the controversy political persecution or judicial overreach. This time, their silence was the most chilling response of all, and when that silence finally broke, it was not to defend him, but to indict him. Jonathan Hadley, one of the most respected legal scholars at the Heritage Foundation, the intellectual fortress of modern conservatism, and a longtime defender of expansive presidential power, appeared on television with an unprecedented gravity. He did not mince words. "We have always tolerated hardball politics," Hadley said, his voice measured but razor sharp, but threatening to use federal power to imprison members of your own party for voting their conscience. That's not politics. That's criminal. Legal analyses began pouring in like a flood. And this time, they did not come from CNN or MSNBC, but from conservative law journals themselves. Experts pointed out that the language captured on the recording crossed a clear red line. It was no longer a matter of ethical gray zones. Explicit discussions about coordinating with IRS and DOJ officials to target specific individuals in order to alter their voting behavior could constitute criminal coercion and, more seriously, witness tampering under federal law. Washington's legal circles began whispering that this was no trivial civil lawsuit or symbolic impeachment hearing. These were felonies, crimes carrying potential prison sentences measured in years. This shift in legal perspective stripped Trump of his final shield, legitimacy. He was no longer seen by conservative elites as a political victim, but increasingly as a walking legal liability. Hard on the heels of the legal blow came the collapse of the money pipeline. Wall Street has always hated instability, but it hates self-destruction even more. As soon as the contents of the recording and the letter signed by 23 lawmakers began circulating, the once burning hotlines between New York and Palm Beach suddenly went cold. A legendary Wall Street bundler who had quietly raised more than $12 million for pro-Trump super PACs made a brief but brutal phone call to a financial reporter. Speaking on condition of anonymity, he said bluntly, "I invest in the Republican Party so they'll cut taxes and loosen business regulations, not so they can use my money to hire lawyers for a civil war." The message was unmistakable. The tap had been shut off. At least 2 billionaire donors figures with decisive behind-the-scenes influence sent private notices to the RNC announcing they were freezing all contributions until the situation was clarified. They did not want their names or fortunes associated with what looked like an authoritarian purge. For Trump's massive campaign apparatus, burning through millions of dollars a day just to stay operational, the sudden cutoff of cash was more painful than any court ruling. It was like pulling the ventilator from a critically ill patient. No money meant no ads, no rallies, and most importantly, no fear among opponents. Trump's power was being eroded at its financial roots. But the final fatal blow, the one that truly panicked strategists at the RNC, came from the numbers. In politics, emotions can deceive, but data does not lie. And the data released by Monmouth University on the afternoon of January 13th amounted to a death sentence for any hope of victory in 2026 and 2028. Post-scandal polling revealed a tectonic shift in the American electorate. While Trump's core MAGA base remained blindly loyal, the group that decides elections, independent voters, had turned away decisively. The number 67% glowed red on strategic analysis screens. 67% of independent and moderate voters said that threatening to use state power against political opponents was disqualifying for leadership. Not concerning, not problematic, completely disqualifying for the Republican Party. This was an existential catastrophe. They might win primaries fueled by base anger, but they could not win general elections while losing 2/3 of independent voters. Electoral models were rerun, and the results painted the map overwhelmingly blue. Lawmakers in swing states stared at those numbers and saw their own political annihilation, not because they had done something wrong, but because they were tied to a captain steering straight toward the rocks. Inside party strategy offices, confidence gave way to panic. Leaders realized that continuing to shield Trump would lead to a blood bath at the ballot box. American voters might forgive sexual scandals. They might overlook crude rhetoric, but they have a deep-seated allergy to authoritarian abuse of power, and the recording was irrefutable proof of exactly that. Thus, in less than 24 hours after the letter was sent, the tripod of Trump's power was violently shaken. The law now labeled him a coercive actor. Wall Street viewed him as a toxic investment, and voters saw him as a threat to democracy. The Republican Party stood at a historic crossroads. One path led to the painful removal of a tumor to save the body. The other meant following their leader into the abyss. But with money drying up, legal pressure mounting, and votes evaporating, the choice no longer seemed to be theirs. They had been backed into a corner, left with only one option: to wait and see how the wounded beast in Palm Beach would strike back. And history has shown Donald Trump is most dangerous when he has nothing left to lose. As predicted, the wounded beast struck back. Early the next morning, Truth Social erupted with a barrage of furious all-caps posts. Instead of denying the existence of the recording or explaining its context, Donald Trump aimed his spear directly at the signatories. He explicitly named Senator Webb and Representative Mercer, branding them cowardly traitors and vermin who must be permanently purged from the MAGA movement. But this very outburst of rage inadvertently exposed a fatal Achilles heel. Legal experts were quick to point out a striking paradox. Trump was concentrating all his fire on the messengers rather than denying the message. His complete failure to dispute the substance of the January 8th meeting amounted to the most forceful indirect admission of its authenticity. He did not say, "I didn't do this." He effectively said, "How dare you rat me out?" Inside the RNC, the situation now resembled a battlefield without generals. While the party base seethed with calls to sacrifice, the 23 lawmakers who dared rebel, party leadership scrambled in desperation to plug the massive holes in a ship steadily sinking in a legal ocean. The rupture had become so deep that it was beyond repair. The story may end here, but history is opening a chapter darker than any before it. The biggest question remains unanswered. Does the Republican Party have the courage to surgically remove the tumor to save its political life? Or will it allow itself to be crushed between two jaws pressure from the king and punishment by the law? A dangerous precedent for democracy now hangs over Washington like the sword of Damocles. All of America is holding its breath, waiting to see who will blink first in this fight for survival.